Okay, let's get right to it. You know, back by popular demand are Rex Burks and Owen Younger, the gentleman that back there in the back. We had them here, I think it was in May. Was it May? And you know, these two guys are funny, they're friends, and you'll see that their interaction is genuine and warm and fun. And we had so much good feedback from their presentation that day, we decided to have them back. I'm not going to give you a lot about their history. They'll do that. But both of them, they were raised in fundamentalist Christian homes, and were Christians until they reached the age of reason, I guess. And what they've been doing over the last, I guess, close to a year and a half or more, is each Sunday they visit a different Christian denomination of church. And they visit openly as atheists and interact with the people there in a friendly way, and I think that's a fantastic thing for our organization to do. One of the challenges we have with an organization like this is trying to configure one that meets the needs of everybody. You know, it's not uncommon that when we have new people come to the group, maybe they're still in the angry atheist phase. I know I went through that. Spent a lot of years being mad at God, and surrounded myself with atheists, and the language that we use when we're all together. And fast forward that some 6, 8, 9, 10 years, the next thing you know, I'm in this perfect atheist bubble, and everybody outside that bubble is stupid. They're not as smart as I am. They're not as moral as I am. And somewhere along the way, I realized that I had become just like those that I was criticizing. And somehow over the last couple of years, my how I choose to walk through the world as an atheist has changed significantly. I sometimes get negative feedback from some members of the community because of that. There are those that are justifiably angry at religion. There are some stories in here of people who, because of their involvement in the church, the trajectory of their lives is not what it would have been had they been free of that dogma. And they're trying to process that. And so trying to be an organization that can meet the needs of all of those is a real challenge. And that's why I love when Rex and Owen are coming back today, because what they have to say is, their approach to it is I think more in line with the approach that I want to see. Like most of you there, I have dear friends that are Christians, and I just adore them, and I don't want to offend them. I have family members that are Christians, and I don't want to offend them. And so how do I move through the world as an atheist without alienating some of the people that I love, and without closing myself off from relationships that I could benefit from if I could nurture? And so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Rex Burks and Owen Younger.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Take up your hymnals. No, just kidding. We're not going to do that.
I'm pretty sure he was kidding about that.
So one of the points I wanted to make right from the beginning, and I appreciate Al's comments, because I think the version of us that Al perceives is the version of us we want to be, and we aren't always, but we try to be. When we talk about answering the claims of Christianity, a lot of what we say would probably apply to any religious setting, probably applies to Islam, probably applies to other, Judaism, but that's not what we came from. So my examples and Owen's examples throughout are going to be about Christianity, but certainly this would apply probably to other religions as well.
And when we say claims, we're not talking about answering the claim that Jesus was the risen Son of God.
Because of course he was.
Right. We're taking claims and breaking them, not enough coffee or too much coffee, breaking them into categories and framing them in a way that really kind of helps group ideas together to make them easier to understand.
And all of this is based on nearly 2 years now of visiting different churches.
Right. Okay, first things first, I'm not going to say who is who. One of us is Rex, and one of us is Owen. One of us is ridiculously tall.
So we actually put this slide in all of our PowerPoints now, because people meet us as Rex and Owen, and they address us as Rex and Owen, and they don't remember which one is Rex and Owen.
It started, I think, when I drew on the whiteboard at one of the church
At the Methodist church.
The Methodist church. I drew on the whiteboard the tall stick figure, and I put Rex, and the short, good-looking stick figure was Owen.
That's right.
By the way, I'm a pilot for a living, so I've also got aviator shades on.
There you go. Okay, so last time we were here, our entire presentation was about our project visiting churches, and we're not going to repeat all that ground. But for those of you who weren't here, I want to just briefly talk about the project itself. So, as Al said, Owen and I both grew up in a single fundamentalist denomination. His was Church of Christ, mine was Herbert Armstrong, Worldwide Church of God. And so we realized when we got to talking years later that we didn't know a whole lot about the other denominations. And so we wanted to visit Baptist churches, Methodist churches, Lutheran churches, Episcopalian churches, Presbyterian churches, and we have. And so that was the genesis of the project. But we also wanted to not just sit in the pew and hear the service. You can sit home and watch YouTube for that. We wanted to go to the Sunday school classes specifically because they're interactive, specifically because we can talk with the believers and ask them what they believe and talk to them about different issues. And we made a couple of promises to ourselves at the beginning of this project. One is that we would always, always tell the truth. We are the good guys. We are the ones who, we believe have the truth. And so we're not going to go in there and pretend to be something we're not. But we also always wanted to look for a specific invitation. So we looked at the church's website and they say, everyone's welcome, so we're welcome. But that being said, we wanted to walk in and have the experience that anyone walking off the street would have. We didn't want some red carpet experience. We didn't want to, contact the minister ahead of time and say, we're atheists, we want to visit your church, and, have any kind of greeting like that. We wanted to have the experience that anyone walking off the street would have, and it's been truly fascinating.
Fascinating. So we can break Christian beliefs, and I think we could break any belief, any religious set of beliefs down into 5 things. But from the Christian perspective that Rex and I sort of came out of, you can really say 5 things. The first thing is that there is some supernatural edifice, that there are spirits and angels and demons, and there's a God and there's a devil, and there are miracles, and that the supernatural things that we postulate in our faith are real. They're not imaginary. They're actual things that are out there. Second thing we can say is, at least from a Christian perspective, my religious book is divine. By and large, Christians don't know where it came from. They just know that it's the literal.
It's a magic book.
It's right. It's the literal revealed word of God. The third thing that Christians generally believe is that the plan of salvation and God's plans in particular are beautiful, which makes them meaningful to us as humans, which is yet one more reason why we should adhere to Christianity.
And so you'll notice these first two, the supernatural and the Bible, these are truth claims. The third one is a subjective claim, an evaluation of the contents of that.
Right. And so would be the fourth one, the proposition that Christianity generally is good for humanity. You hear this argued a lot. So you're an atheist. So what? They're not hurting anybody. As it happens, we have a different perspective. We'll talk about that later.
We hear this from atheists, actually.
We actually hear this from atheists sometimes. The last one is that life without Christianity, or insert religious belief here, but particularly Christianity, would be meaningless and hopeless. Turns out, we have a different perspective.
So in terms of the summary of our counterpoints to these arguments, and this is a slide from our last presentation, and it's the last one you'll see that's a repeat for those of you who weren't here. In response to supernatural claims that God is real and miracles are real, we believe that the freethinker response is there is zero good evidence for God or miracles. And so let's talk about what kind of evidence there could be. On the claim that the Bible is a divine perfect book, we would argue that the Bible is obviously man-made. Doesn't mean it's all false, doesn't mean it's all true, it just means it's written by people, just like every other book. That the plan is beautiful, we would argue that the plan is often grotesque, arbitrary, and offensive.
More than often it is.
That Christianity is good for humanity, we would argue that Christianity is an extreme obstacle to human flourishing. And finally, that life without it would be meaningless and hopeless. We would argue that a life of reason and free thought can be very meaningful and very hopeful. So this is what we will be talking about for the next half hour or so.
We've kind of stacked these claims in increasing sort of liberalism, right? The most fundamentalist adherents are going to believe very strongly in claims 1 and 2. if there are people who tend to be more liberal in their Christianity, either they never really took it seriously or they were fundamentalists in their youth and they became more liberal later in terms of the specifics of what they believe, we find that they might occupy some zone between points 3 and 5. So let's go to the first discussion here on the first point.
So obviously the first claim encapsulate a whole lot of what we call Christian doctrine. It's the idea that God and miracles are real. So what do we mean when we say miracles? It's any supernatural claim. If you claim that God created the universe in 6 literal days, that's a supernatural claim. If you claim that he intervened in human history and had a chosen people, that's a miraculous claim. If you believe that he became Jesus in human form and died and was resurrected again, those are miraculous claims. But also more mundane things like the manna from heaven or turning water into wine. These would all be miraculous claims. And Owen, what would you answer to any of these miraculous claims?
There's actually no evidence for them at all.
And what could be evidence for such a thing?
Testament, documentary evidence that is recorded and agreed to in history, or if I saw it. For example, if I ever saw a miracle happen, if in normal experience we saw people routinely get up after being dead, that might be something that we would expect could be attested to in a book. But the truth is we would have, the evidence itself would have to be as extraordinary as the claim made.
So on this point, and this is the only point where we're making any supernatural claims, where the Christians are making supernatural claims, we want to remind you, if you're ever in this situation dealing with Christians and the claims they're making, don't be confused by the burden of proof. And we're reminded of something that Carl Sagan said over and over again when he was alive, is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I don't think that a paragraph written in an ancient book is extraordinary evidence. I think that's pretty mundane evidence. And so notice that this is a different category than when we're saying something like Christianity is good for the world. That's a subjective claim. But when you're talking about supernatural claims, miraculous claims, the burden of proof is on the believer. And so when I said to Owen, what would be good evidence, what Owen meant to say was, well, it's not for me to provide the evidence, right? It's for the one making the claim.
And that evidence would have to be as extraordinary as the claim itself in order for me to accept it. I mean, it's common sense, right?
So some of you, in fact, tell me by show of hands, are any of you familiar with Josh McDowell or Lee Strobel or this type of literature? Okay, good. So this is a Christian apologetics literature. And they have lots of students, but these are probably the two that people know the best. And one of the things that we find when talking to believers about the lack of evidence for supernatural claims is that they will point to these books on the shelf. And really, that's enough. It's this idea that the smart people have figured it out. I don't even have to read the book. I just have to have it sitting on the shelf, knowing that the smart people have figured it out, and that's enough. And I think that's the role that this Christian apologetics plays. But there's a real sleight of hand if you actually read these books, which I have. The sleight of hand is that the evidence they're providing is for mundane claims. It's not for supernatural claims. They'll provide evidence for the mundane claims and say, so see, the Bible's reliable, and therefore when the Bible says that this miracle happened, you can believe it. Right?
There really was an ancient civilization that lived in Palestine. Peace out, atheists. Take that.
Right.
The Bible's real.
So on the next slide, I want to explore a little bit what we mean by mundane claims versus supernatural claims, because these are the kinds of claims that Strobel and McDowell and all of their ilk will be defending. The idea that Jesus existed, okay? I don't know if Jesus existed. I'm persuaded he probably did, but we don't have a lot of good evidence. But they will hammer documentary evidence that the followers of Jesus existed and that they believed he existed. Okay. Fine, that's a mundane claim. The idea that there was a wandering teacher in Palestine in the first century doesn't require a miracle, right? In fact, we know there were a lot of them, and if one of them was named Jesus, so be it. Again, a second sort of mundane claim would be that the Romans would crucify such a troublemaker in first century Palestine.
Wasn't terribly unusual to be crucified.
Right. The
by
one
the
thing we
Romans.
know from history is that the Romans crucified an awful lot of people. It was a sort of a hobby with them. And then third is the idea that there was a tomb, or that Jesus had these moral teachings, or that he had followers. All of these are mundane claims. Notice what's not here. There's no supernatural claim here. And if you read the apologists, this is the sort of information that they're defending, right? They're defending these mundane claims. But then they make this leap to these supernatural claims.
The presumption that just because there may have been a dude named Jesus walking around in first century Palestine, he is necessarily therefore the Son of God. The presumption that just because he was crucified, he was born of a virgin and was a deity in the flesh.
And this is why I say it's a sleight of hand, right?
Right.
Because they're defending the book by providing contextual evidence for these mundane claims, and then using that to take the leap of believe the supernatural claims.
And they do it frequently in an insidious way that transfers the burden of proof back onto the skeptic. It's disappointing to see that, but we see the tactic, and it comes up a lot. So claim 2, if you don't buy the supernatural stuff, you could conceivably be a Christian and say, Genesis was metaphorical. It isn't intended to be literal. You could look at the Jesus story and say, the resurrection, maybe you didn't physically get resurrected. You don't need bodies in heaven, so maybe that was kind of a spiritual thing, and that's really sort of referring to something spiritual. Maybe you could minimize the importance of the supernatural elements of the story. But you could still be a Christian by pointing to the Bible and saying, the Bible is a divine, perfect book. That it's a purely moral, it's a wonderful book, it tells us everything we need to know about how to be good human beings. And the humanist reply to that, Rex, would be?
Well, obviously it's man-made, but I would say that the thing that I've heard again and again from the believers, if you press them for evidence as to point 1, what is the evidence of the supernatural claims? Backed into a corner, what they'll cite is that the Bible is the
Bible
evidence.
says so.
The Bible says so. That's the evidence that we have. So now we move to evaluating the Bible. Does it make sense to consider the Bible good evidence? If the Bible was, in fact, a magic book, if it had fallen from heaven, from the creator of the universe, then obviously, yes, we should read it differently than we read every other book. But if you actually look at the authorship and construction and timeline related to the Bible, it is clearly man-made. It's clearly not a magic book. It's very much a product of its time and the people who wrote it.
So what would we expect? Let's imagine, let's suspend our disbelief just for a minute for the sake of the discussion, say, what would we expect to find in a book that was literally given to humans by the author of the entire universe? Would we expect that it really would in fact represent the paragon of morality? Probably. We would expect that
or at least be good literature.
Or at least be good literature. Would we expect that the moral lessons we learn from it are transcendent and not apparently bound up in time? Yes, we would expect that. Would we expect that and I'm going to use a legal term here, the chain of custody, would we expect an extreme clarity on precisely how that book was transmitted to us? Again, yes. In other words, if we asked ourselves objective questions about what we might expect, if in fact this artifact were divine, what would we find? Then if we look at the Bible,
does it meet any of those tests?
Does it meet any of those tests? And it turns out, no. The Bible is profoundly similar to many other ancient texts. It reflects its time, it reflects its culture, it reflects those things mythically and morally. In fact, we do not see any substantial difference in the kinds of things the Bible says than anything else that we might find that was written in that era. And believe me, there are hundreds of other works of literature out there that are from that same.
In fact, it's not even particularly unique in terms of early Christian writings. I mean, even if you just limit it to early Christian writings, the books that made it into the Bible are not particularly unique.
And there's a whole lot of stuff that didn't make it into the Bible. We'll talk about that.
So first we would look at the authorship, right? You would expect that if God were directing this process, we would at least know who wrote these books. And in fact, we don't. And this is something scholars have known for a long time. The four Gospels, for instance, everybody knows Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, the books are completely anonymous. They were written much later by people who never knew Jesus in a language Jesus never spoke. We do not know who wrote these books. We do know that in the 2nd and 3rd century, the church scrambled to ascribe names to them so that we could have authority for them, and that's where we get the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as they tried to find companions of Jesus and followers of Jesus who would fit that mold, but in fact, they're completely anonymous.
In point of fact, of the 27 so-called books in the New Testament, we actually only know the author of 7 of them. We don't actually know anything about that particular person.
The Apostle Paul McCartney.
The Apostle Paul.
I mean, just the Apostle Paul, not Paul
But through
Let it
and what I'm saying, by the way, has been completely uncontroversial in circles of biblical scholarship in the English and German-speaking world for more than 200 years. There's nothing controversial about that. Doesn't matter where you go, Bible scholars are going to say, yeah, that's actually true. We know that of the 13 letters from Paul, fully half of them are forgeries. They're outright forgeries. Only 7 of them were written by Paul, and we know that through analyzing word choice and syntax and grammar and vocabulary. We see the similarities between those letters. But it's fascinating that, in fact, the 4 gospel accounts that we have are all anonymous. None of them claim to be first-hand accounts, and apologists are going to tell you they are, but they're lying. They have no justification for that. And finally, the things that were not included in the Bible show even more diversity. And I said this the last time we were here. I encourage everybody to go read Lost Christianities by Bart Ehrman. What a fascinating book. But wait, there's more.
So the New Testament books obviously were written decades after the events narrated and show a clear evolution of the myth over time. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of this. So if Paul was the first one writing, and you read the 7 undisputed letters of Paul, what's most astonishing is what he never says. He never mentions Jesus having a physical ministry. He never mentions Jesus working a single miracle. He never mentions a virgin birth. He never mentions a bodily resurrection. It's always in some sort of spiritual sense. And Paul apparently had never even heard these stories. If you look at a book like Romans, where he's pulling out all the stops to make the case for Christianity, if he had a fact like a virgin birth, he would have mentioned it, and he doesn't. Then you flash forward about 20 years to the first gospel, which is Mark, and you see Jesus as a wise teacher sort of walking around, talking about a coming Messiah, which he doesn't identify as himself. Again, no virgin birth, no bodily resurrection, no resurrection at all, actually. The original Mark ends with an empty tomb. But then by the time you get to, another 10 years after that, and you've got Matthew and Luke, suddenly we've got a virgin birth, though the 2 stories don't agree at all. And then by the time you get to John, closer to the 2nd century, now Jesus is walking around declaring himself to be God. And you see the story has grown in a few decades from these different communities that created these Gospels. And the Jesus of Mark, the wise teacher walking around saying pithy things about character development, is completely different than the Jesus of John, who walks around claiming to be God for 3 years, which would have gotten him stoned in about a month. But this was far removed from Palestine. And all of these books they show the clear evolution of the myth over time, even within the 1st century. And if you look outside the New Testament, as Owen was saying, we have 4 Gospels in the New Testament, but there are a dozen others that early church created, some of which survive in fragments, some of which we've lost, but other Gospels that tell the story in different ways, sometimes more mundane, sometimes more miraculous. We have other epistles, we have other Acts, we have other apocalypses, and so all of this other early Christian literature shows an incredible diversity in the 1st and 2nd century, but it also shows how the myth is growing over time, which again, we're not... On claim number 2, we're not evaluating whether this is true or not. We're evaluating, is this what a divine process would look like, or is this what a man-made process would look like? And we think that this has the fingerprints of human activity all over it.
And the last argument we would make about the Bible itself is that it wasn't until the 3rd Synod of Carthage in 397 AD that any formal committee anywhere in the Christian world actually came up with a list that is what we consider to be the current New Testament.
And even then, it wasn't settled.
Even then, it wasn't settled.
The first time
right.
it was proposed.
There are actually churches in Africa, Christian churches in Africa, that have different versions of the Bible. If you look back at it, right, it took nearly 4 complete centuries for the codex of what defines Christianity now to really be settled. And that wasn't really completely final. In fact, which versions of those books eventually became the Latin Vulgate and eventually became the first printed Bibles is a subject for a whole nother set of discussions.
Well, as an aside here, there's an interesting thing that you'll hear from Christians, and I'm sure you've all heard this, is when they're arguing for creation, for example, they will talk about the perfect complexity of physics, the perfect complexity of human DNA, the perfect complexity and predictability of the spiraling galaxies, or the magic of a blade of grass and photosynthesis. And they'll look at the natural world and see all of this perfection and predictability, and they'll make the leap that, oh, there must be design. You know, this kind of perfection must come from divine design. And maybe that's a compelling argument, I don't know. But the very same people would look at this process, the process of the creator of the universe who wants to communicate his most important message about his son dying for your sins so that you can have eternal salvation. That most important message, more important than the spiraling galaxy or the DNA or whatever they're citing as design.
The germ theory of disease.
This process is extremely sloppy and extremely, human fingerprints all over it. Like, it looks nothing like the order of DNA. It looks like a very haphazard mythology developing, having gone to the least literate part of the world at the least literate time to bring your most important message. It's just sloppy. It doesn't look like the work of God. It looks
very
like the
man-made.
work of ancient man.
So I think we have looked at the first 2 claims, the supernatural and the Bible as a divine book, and we've kind of made our best arguments about why we can reject those. But we've still encountered Christians in the church visits that say, yeah, I'm willing to set that stuff aside. I'm not really a fundamentalist, but I do believe in Jesus, and I think the plan of salvation is beautiful, and I think there's plenty of reasons to continue to be a Christian. So now we take one more step down that road. The claim number 3 is that God's plans are beautiful, that the plan of salvation is beautiful, that those things should be meaningful in our lives and should drive how we act and behave. And the reply is,
no, God's plans are often grotesque and arbitrary and offensive. This is beautiful, right? For those of you who are counting Jesus in our PowerPoint, I think this is number 4. Yeah. Is that the plural of Jesus? So this is actually Mel Gibson's Jesus. Did you see this film? It's pretty horrible.
it's like nonstop blood.
Right.
Yeah.
Just like Mel Gibson. Pretty horrible.
Right.
Oh, now here's my favorite part of our presentation today. So we're going to talk about the problem with the plan and the problem with the belief system. We're going to start with God himself. The Christian God is a bad God. Would you want this guy as your neighbor? And now, you're all in for a treat. Owen is going to do his best Richard Dawkins.
I've been practicing this for a week.
All right. Take it away.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser. A misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I rest my case.
Tip your waiters and waitresses. I'll be here for another 25 minutes.
Okay, so God's a bad guy. Okay, well, but surely there's something else that we can find beauty in this.
Surely there's more.
Well, so at least he's got a good plan, right?
Of course.
Of course.
The whole human sacrifice, substitutional punishment thing.
Wait a
minute.
If you're counting
wait a minute.
Jesus, I think that's number 5.
Why did the author of the universe need to have a human sacrifice in order to forgive us?
Why did he make us flawed in the first place, right?
Right.
And if he wanted to forgive us, just forgive us.
Couldn't
Why
you
do
just
this
said,
whole charade?
peace out, man, you're forgiven.
Yeah.
It's all good. So I can think of that, but that's not actually what we find. How many of you think that it would be cool if you had children and one of your children got caught with a hand in a cookie jar and pulled the hand away and accidentally broke the cookie jar, and so you're going to punish your kid, how many of you would be willing to ground the other kid
Yes.
in order to make that okay?
Mm-hmm.
No. I'm going to go with no on that. So why is it a good plan to substitute somebody else in really a very gruesome human sacrifice way in order to decide that it's cool to forgive?
Well, and you know, Christians tell us when they look at this picture, they see the most beautiful moment in all of history.
And they're not kidding, like they really mean it.
The most perfect moment of sacrifice and love, the expression of love, and I just see a guy nailed to a cross.
For God so loved the world.
I don't think anyone would believe this is beautiful, but for the fact that we were all taught it as children, that this was something that was indoctrinated into us.
If you've never heard this story, but so it turns out Christianity was really pretty effective in evangelizing, particularly in places where you were going to have to believe or suffer consequences. But if in a modern context somebody came to you, you've never heard this story, and somebody came to you and said, "Hey, this is great," would you? I mean, seriously, this is the Loftus outsider test for faith. Would you really think this was a good plan? And the answer is no. Clearly, it's not.
Well, okay, maybe it's a bad plan, but at least it's working, right, Owen?
Well, is it?
Okay.
It turns out we've got a pie chart.
Okay. So, first of all, this is all of us in a few years, okay?
This is the FOF.
Roasting in
the
hell.
Board, the FOF board is right in here in the cauldron.
At least there's a fair amount of nudity in hell. And for people of color, at least we're all Caucasians in hell.
Right.
So that's
Right.
something.
So there's
No, but on the question of has this beautiful plan even worked? Well, let's look at the world. Now we've had 2,000 years to spread this message, right? 2,000 years, and we're at about 30% and dropping, right? So clearly the message isn't getting out.
what 1/3 of the world presumably is going to avoid this. But the other 2/3 of us were screwed.
Well, and fully half of these Christians believe the other half aren't real Christians.
So, and by the way, like the Christianity 34% right there actually includes Mormons, and everybody knows those people aren't real Christians.
No, of course not.
Well, that was actually pretty funny. Okay, so not only is it a bad plan, it really isn't working. So what else can we say about the morality that we see in the Bible? What can we say about...
It's beautiful.
It is?
Apparently.
So we have slavery, we have the treatment of women as property, we have the murder of children, which, by the way, is what filicidal meant when Dawkins was speaking earlier. We have genocide.
And actually, God really likes killing children.
I really
you can
wonder...
find a lot of instances of that.
I really wonder if the Amalekites find the Bible's version of morality to be acceptable. I don't know. The chosen people, like, seriously, imagine you have children. Like, do you ever tell one of your kids you're my favorite? I don't have kids. I don't know, but I can't imagine. I don't know. Maybe you do. I don't know. Sickness is punishment, but there's more. Like, I'm not just going to make you sick. I'm going to make your kids sick. I'm going to make your family sick, and it's going to follow you for generations. That's actually in the Bible. Like, it's
family values.
Under the fourth generation. Human sacrifice, the Ten Commandments with a question mark, like they're really pretty
It's the most perfect law ever
Right,
given.
the most perfect law ever. Right. Don't covet your neighbor's wife.
Well,
because that's his property.
Don't covet the house or the
Right.
wife or
Right.
the ox or
Right.
anything that's your neighbor's.
Right.
So the wife fits right there between the house and the ox in terms of priority.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a good point. Capricious and extreme punishments.
Stone your children for talking back to you.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass on the whole biblical morality thing, right? Your mileage may vary. So now we've talked about claims 1 through 3. You can be a Christian because you think all the supernatural stuff and that the Bible is divine. You could be a Christian and set those things aside and be a Christian because you think the plan is a great plan and you're going to sign up for it. It's beautiful. It's the greatest story ever told. There's even a movie about it. Or maybe you're not really persuaded by any of those things, but you're stuck on point 4 because you think Christianity is good for the world.
So this actually relates to our church visits, because when we visit the more left-leaning churches, the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians and about half the Methodists, they will tell us, yeah, I kind of think the Bible's man-made and those miracles are probably just myth, and yeah, there are problems with the story, and maybe God's a bad guy, but at least it's good for the world, right? The world needs this. So we keep playing church because the world needs this.
Besides, it's not hurting anybody, is it?
It's good for the world.
It's good for the world. So before we actually address this, everybody thinks that the bad stuff is bad, right? I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that Christianity is awful because Catholic priests rape kids.
The priests raping the kids, the Inquisition, the witch trials, the Westboro picketing veterans' funerals, airplanes flying into buildings. Everybody thinks this is bad. So that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the bad stuff.
I'm not going to ask any Christian person in a church to defend any of that stuff. That's not fair. Seriously. None of them would agree with it either. The point that we want to make is that the safest, nicest, coolest, gentlest version of Christianity you
Your
can
grandma's
find,
church.
with the little old lady sitting in a country church somewhere who's never heard a fly and loves people and really genuinely cares about the world, believes things that are still hurting humanity.
Killing us, actually.
And so we're
These
gonna,
people, look how happy they are, right? What could possibly be wrong with that?
we're
They look
gonna-
happier than you do, right now.
Right. And more engaged in their presentation than...
Yes. They are washed in the blood.
That's right. They're washed in something. So we're going to kind of run through these. Christianity distorts scientific advancement. It distorts the education of our children. It distorts understanding by the general public of important subjects that bear on decisions we make in public policy. And Christianity has done that for 2,000 years. And let's not pull any punches.
But that would never happen, like, say, in the state of Texas in the 21st century, right?
With school books. You guys remember that big thing? I'm a member of the FFRF. My wife and I are, and like we actually sent letters to the state legislature. I'm sure a lot of us did.
How did that go?
It didn't go very well
okay.
for us.
Okay.
Right. So Rex really loves little snide little screw turning things here. We've got the Creation Museum. The Creation Museum. Here
this is the
Right.
Temple of Ken Ham. Yeah. How many of you love Ken Ham? I cannot get enough Ken Ham.
I can't get enough. Right.
He is the missing link.
He is.
What else, Owen?
But there's more. Christianity distorts and devalues critical thinking. You'll hear this, and in church today, right now in Dallas, within 5 miles of us, there are probably 15 or 20 congregations that have some version of this, and we bolded it on the slide.
So right. So
this is from the Bible.
We joke a lot, and if you're talking about stoning your kids, fine. You're not going to hear that in any of these churches within 5 miles of here. But this is not some side point. This is not a small thing in modern Christianity. This is a major theme. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. This idea of not leaning on your own understanding is actually held up as a virtue. This is what they tell the children. This is what they tell the children over and over and over again. You can't think for yourself. You shouldn't think for yourself. You've got to trust God. You've got to trust the church authority. This is a damnable idea, and it is not a small side point. It is the thrust of modern Christianity, especially to children.
And that's a poisonous message. Christianity grossly distorts sexual ethics. For 20 centuries, we have walked around as Western civilization under the profound influence of Christianity and Judaism, have walked around condemning people who have sexual preferences that differ from the majority of the population.
But mostly the women, right?
Right.
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 This was actually Owen's purity ring from high school, by the way.
Wow. So he's not kidding, but we agreed he wasn't going to say that.
No, but the main thrust of all of this is something we mentioned before. It's the subjugation of women. It's the idea that women are the property of men, and that as such needed to be pure for the men. And the men could have as many women as they wanted, but the women needed to be pure for the man.
How many of you know how many wives King Solomon had? The wisest man.
Did he even know
ever.
for sure? I think we get to some sort of spitball guesses.
The Bible gives the number, and the Bible is literally true.
No.
So he had 300 wives and 700 concubines? Mm-hmm. Right? Wow. Right. So your mileage may vary, right?
I've only had 2 wives, and not even at the same time, and that was more than I could handle. So, yeah.
Wow. So he went there. Okay. The other thing that really is a burden and has caused a lot of conflict is this idea that homosexuality is evil, that it's a sin, that it should be a crime. It was a criminal act in much of the Western world. In fact, until very recently, I mean, in living memory, that the sodomy law in Texas was struck down. I was in school when it happened. It was a big deal. There is no good reason for society or for anybody to look at that and think it's abhorrent. And yet we have told people who have these thoughts that they're broken, that they're evil, that they're awful human beings. And if you consider the mental angst and anguish that has caused for 2,000 years, it's disgusting. It's reprehensible. And I got to be honest with you, even the coolest, nicest, kindest version of Christianity still believes Romans chapter 1, where Paul spends half of that damn chapter railing against how awful homosexuality is. And that's not in the Old Testament. That's in the New Testament.
But he also condemns envy and gossip. So,
right.
But no one's ever been burned for those things, to my knowledge.
Right.
Okay, so outside of sexual ethics, specifically, Christianity distorts morality. And you all know the story of Eve. You know, she was our great-great-grandmother, and she's talking to the snake in the garden. And I say, you know what? The serpent is the real hero of the story. Because as a humanist, I believe we should look to ourselves and our own intellect and our own experience and our own observation to determine what is good and evil, what is right and wrong. We should base that on our observation and the evidence, and we ought to be getting more and more moral as time goes on. And what did the serpent say? The serpent said to the woman, "You surely will not die, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Which to me, that's a good thing, right? That's what we need to do. So let's all think of the snake as the hero of the story.
I love that. The serpent was the hero of the story. Your eyes will be opened, knowing good and evil. Be your own moral agent. Think for yourself. And Christians tell us that those sentences are the root of all sin in the world.
Well, and if you consider the good and evil assessments of the God of the Bible, I think we can do a better job. I think a 4-year-old could do a better job.
Right. So Christianity devalues this life. The suffering that you feel now, the challenges in the world, none of those things are important. The important thing is the reward you get in heaven. The things that are happening in the world, the tribulations that are happening in your life, those are things that God is putting in your path to help prepare you for your ultimate salvation. Don't worry, give no thought to the future, says Apostle Paul. Your reward comes later. Christianity devalues this life. Here's the problem. There is no life to follow. That's a myth, and it's our responsibility.
C.1.
Right. It's our responsibility to do the very best we can, and not just with our lives, but with everybody else's.
I think this also relates to public policy. You know, there are a lot of sort of firebrand atheists who are, try to get God we trust off the money and under God out of the pledge and Christian invocations out of Congress. And those are probably all good things to do. But the problem is, if you could wave your magic wand and get rid of all of those things, you still have half the population with their elected representatives who believe this. And so even with no public expression of religion or Christianity or God, the problem is in the belief. The problem is that they still don't value this life as much. They don't value justice now. They don't value social progress now as much as they would if they saw this as the only life. And there's the insidious enemy, even if you can wipe away all of the expressions of it.
Christianity distorts our view of justice. It's a similar theme to the prior slide, that the things that are wrong in the world now are things that we don't really have to work to correct. A Redeemer is coming to fix those things. Jesus will come and set things right. There will be a kingdom that comes to earth, and that kingdom will make all things just.
There will be ultimate justice in the end.
Right.
And if that's not true, how much more motivated should we be to make sure that we can achieve justice in this world? And when I say justice, and you think maybe in a criminal context or someone falsely imprisoned, and those things are important too, but I would say it's a justice issue that there are millions of children in the world right now with nothing to eat. That's a justice issue. And if your idea is that Jesus is going to come dry those tears, and he isn't coming, then it's our job to feed those children. And that's why I think Christianity creates an apathy, even if it's subconscious, the idea that the solution is going to come from without.
Christianity makes a virtue of faith, and I would say that religion does this, but again, our focus here is Christianity. This is our background. And we go to the Bible verse. Hebrews 11 says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's from the King James Version, which was translated from the Latin Vulgate.
So think of our point one that we made today, the first claim that the supernatural is real, that God is real, that miracles are real. This whole idea of faith, the concept of faith, to believe it without evidence, which is the definition that Christians will give you, is to basically say we don't have to answer claim one. We don't have to answer for the lack of evidence because our faith is the evidence, which of course is not a virtue. It wouldn't be a virtue in any other context. It wouldn't be a virtue to say I don't have any evidence for what I'm telling you, but I believe it, and so you should respect that. That's what faith asks you to do, but that's a problem.
Imagine a politician standing in front of you and asking you to send him or her to Congress, and one of the reasons that politician gives is, I'm a person of strong faith.
I believe things without evidence.
I believe things without
that's a
evidence.
virtue.
So let's substitute Christianity for, I believe Elvis is still alive, and I'm a person of strong faith, and you should send me to Congress. That guy would never be elected.
Elvis is still alive.
Or gal. Oh.
Now you're fighting.
Rex, we talked about this. We don't ixnay on the Elvis lay. Okay. So
Elvis is in heaven with Jesus.
Right. If we did a simple substitution test where we did Elvis is still alive, or I believe that there's a one-eyed, one-horned, flying purple people eater orbiting Mars, or something else ridiculous, we would agree that that is absurd. And yet we have been indoctrinated, even socially and culturally, to respect that this idea of faith is sacrosanct and that we should never attack it. Like that has a special status, and that we are not entitled to observe that really is an absurd claim. And we really need to get past that.
I started out by saying we were only talking about Christianity today, but for any of you who believe that we may now or in the future have a problem with the Muslim world, this is really our Achilles heel to dealing with that the way we need to deal with that. What we need to be able to do is to tell the Muslim world, and particularly the young people in the Muslim world, that their religion is a myth, that there's no evidence for any of these claims, that they need to wake up and come on into modernity with the rest of us. But why can't we say that? Why can't we leaflet the Arab world with the idea that your religion is man-made? It's this. It's because we need it to defend our religion, the idea that you don't have to have evidence, the idea that the Holy Book is a good source. The fact that we cling to these claims takes away any credibility we would have for the things that we need to be saying to the Muslim world. And so it's not just what Christianity is doing to us, it's what it's keeping us from helping the rest of the world wake up.
So next, Christianity distorts desperately needed long-term planning. Again, we're thinking about public policy. You frequently hear Christians say, and they mean it, if you die and there's nothing, then who cares? Why do you care? Why is it such a big deal? Just let them be. It's not hurting anybody. But you know what it does? It influences education. It influences our opinion of sexual morality. It influences how we interact with justice problems, particularly with subjects of social justice. It affects how we treat children and women. But it more than that interferes with our ability to make real long-term decisions that we must make in order to plan for our future. We have real problems, and they're not going away.
And as I said before, this is not...
Oh, and Paul Ryan.
This is not a side point. This is not some small theme within Christianity. This is the major theme. This is the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth. The whole idea that they tell children from birth is that we are not going to fix this world. The ultimate solution is a returning Jesus and the kingdom of God. And if that's true, hey, great. But if that's not true, what are we going to tell these polar bears when those ice caps are melting? What are we going to tell these kids who have nothing to eat? What are we going to do with this moron?
That's
idea,
not Jesus. That's Paul Ryan.
Is there a difference?
I did it again.
No, but what do you think he thinks the answer to these two problems is? I mean, if he's really honest,
It's
after a couple of
behind him
glasses of wine, what does he think the answer
It's
is?
behind him in the picture.
Yeah. Jesus is going to return and fix it, and we just have to hold on.
Right.
But if that's not true, if no one's coming from outer space to fix our problems, we better be working on these problems. And the fact that more than half the U.S. population doesn't think it's that big of a deal because Jesus is going to fix it, that's a problem.
More than half, like a huge percentage of the population. So this
How many of you know Jesus Camp? I love this film. You seen Jesus Camp? Yeah. If you haven't seen it, please go watch this movie. It's
it's very alarming, but you owe it to yourself to watch it. So this slide, when we were building this presentation, this particular slide, I got up and I waved my arms around and I raised my voice and I was yelling, and we're going to try to get through this slide without me yelling. But this is the message in church right now, today, in denominations all over the United States of America. We are telling kids that they're weak, that they need to have a savior in their life because they can't get by without it, that they're flawed. We're telling kids that their mind is an open book to supernatural. They can't have private thoughts. We're telling them that they're powerless. They cannot
You need
solve,
Jesus.
They can't solve the problems of the world. They're being told, lean not unto their own understanding. Their intellect can't be trusted. They're being told that there are things that are wrong with them. They're being told that their personal relationships are not as important as their relationship with Jesus. And that pisses me off. And if it doesn't piss you off, then I'm not doing a good job telling you how bad this is. This is poison. This is venom in the mind of kids, telling them that when they grow up and they become responsible adults who are supposed to figure out how to solve the world's problems, that they can't do it.
They can't and they shouldn't, and they should look for Jesus to do it. What does a steady diet of 18 years of this, and you reach adulthood having heard this for 18 years, what kind of adult would you be
Christians
when faced
ask
with
why
the world's
atheists
problems?
are angry. Christians ask why people, and Al talked about it, like why do so many atheists, when they leave their faith, why are they angry for so long? And honestly, this is the reason.
Well, and pausing here for a moment, one of the things we talked about last time we spoke here was the idea, sort of building the case to defend the idea that we shouldn't just be non-religious and let them be. The idea that this has a cost, this has a major cost, and it's right here. Probably more than any of the other things we've talked about, this is the cost, this is the problem, and the reason why we should care, the reason why we should continue to throw a lifeline to those Christians and help them out and help wake them up, just like somebody woke all of us up.
Right.
These people need to be woken up. We're not criticizing Christianity because we don't like these people or because we want to belittle these people or make fun of these people or hurt these people. We want to rescue these people. We want to save these people from a bucket load of bad ideas, and that's what needs to happen.
So we're going to push forward here a little bit.
All right?
I'll let you take this one.
Christianity stunts our emotional maturity. If you've ever been to a funeral and you've heard he's in a better place, or after a tragedy, a hurricane, or a mass shooting, you're in my thoughts and prayers, this is bad. This is not helpful. And yet, we haven't evolved as a species. We haven't gotten good at grieving and holding each other and getting each other through it because we tell ourselves these lies. And Christianity obviously does that.
And prayer, by the way, is a really, really great way to feel good about yourself for having actually done nothing affirmative in the world. Okay, resource waste.
Obvious.
I mean, this is a gimme, really, seriously. You hear atheists in our community, freethinkers, talk about how really unfair it is to allow these church groups to retain a tax-free status. But that's only scratching the surface. If you imagine every ounce of work done toward evangelism or toward furthering Christian belief over the last 2,000 years, and you contemplate what we could have achieved if that had been directed towards progress and sanitation and infrastructure and other things, where would we have been? We would have flown to the moon in the 18th century.
All right, so maybe there's no evidence for the supernatural. Maybe the Bible's not a magic book. Maybe the plan is ugly and it's bad for the world. But we still have to do it, Owen, because life without Christianity would be meaningless and hopeless.
Actually, no.
This is what you hear from the most liberal Christians,
Right.
who really don't believe the superstition, but they still hold to this.
They think that you really have, in order to have meaning in your life, you've got to have something bigger than you. And I understand why they would think that. I get that, right? They've been told that their whole life. They're trying to hold on to a faith. But it turns out that hope doesn't come from some pie-in-the-sky dream. Hope comes from empowerment.
Well, and so think about what we said about the poison message to children, that you're weak, that you're flawed, that you need a savior, you need a redeemer. How about instead we spend 18 years teaching children, you are the most evolved species in the galaxy. You have in you the DNA of Newton and Einstein and Da Vinci and Curie and Edison. You have that creativity. You have that problem solving. You have the ability to fix this world. That's a much more empowering message than the idea that you can't and you shouldn't because Jesus is going to fix it.
You're weak and you're helpless and you can't do it. I got to be honest with you that this is a no-brainer. One message is good for the world and for helping us solve our problems, and the other one is causing the problems. So let's talk about meaning in life. Friendship and art and nature and travel and music, particularly good music, not the kind Rex listens to.
And sex. This is
love,
our sex.
Love and sex and wine and family and good meals and literature and education. By the way, you can tell Rex was driving when the slide was built because it doesn't have cigars, beer, or airplanes.
Okay. But the idea here is that the Christian that says life without Christianity is meaningless, what they mean is there's no external meaning. And I would agree. There's no one in the sky pushing meaning onto our lives. We give our lives meaning. And thank your lucky stars, you live in a century and a place and a time of comfort where you can actually enjoy most of the meaning that's available to you. And so we create our own paradise. We create our own meaning.
But more than that, we have to. We can create a paradise on earth. And I would argue that we must. We talked about this idea that the Christians believe that Jesus is going to come solve our problems, that there is a Redeemer, that there is a Savior who's going to come down in the sky and fight the battles of Israel.
Thy kingdom come.
End of time, and we're going to have the reign of Jesus on earth, and that's going to solve our problems. But you know what? That's a fairy tale. That's not real. There are problems in the world. We must solve them. I would argue that this is the moral imperative of humanity, that we created most of the problems we have. We're going to have to solve them.
And believing that someone else is going to come solve them, or that there's another life coming where these problems don't matter, is the greatest obstacle to solving these problems.
So one last slide. Let's get back to the spectrum.
So we wanted to relate this back to the church visits. And not because I expect you all to go visit a bunch of churches, but because you are going to, in your daily life, be dealing with different believers, making different claims. And the point here is that at the most fundamentalist end of the spectrum, the Pentecostals, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Baptists, you're going to hear claims about the supernatural and about the divinity of the Bible. At the more liberal end, you're going to hear claims about the meaninglessness of life without Christianity, or that it's good for the world. Even some of these people, the Presbyterians and Episcopalians that have given up on the supernatural, still make these kinds of claims. And the reason we're differentiating these is because if someone is making this claim and you're arguing this one, you're not responsive to what they're saying. And so if you listen carefully to the sort of claim, it helps you frame a response. And we hope we've helped a little bit in that regard.
As good an advocate as Christopher Hitchens was, man, I miss that guy. As good an advocate as he was, he didn't come out of the faith background that Rex and I grew up in, and that maybe many of you did. And so that he had a blind spot, and he would talk about believing in the talking snake. And you know what? He lost 2/3 of the people who were listening to him because none of them believed it either, and they're still Christians, right? You have, in order to be effective in your advocacy, you don't have to go out and advocate for free thought, though we spent some time talking in our last presentation about why we think you should. We're happy to do that, and we think some people need to, and we feel like that's something we're pretty good at. But in order to be effective in that advocacy, you need to understand who your audience is, who you're talking to, and where they are on the spectrum, so that you can convey the right message and try to plant the seed. You never know when you plant that seed. If you plant the right seed in the right way, you never know if that will germinate. There's actually a person in the room here that was one of the very first atheists I ever met in my life. And he came to here that was 25 years ago, and he came here to hear me give this talk today.
It wasn't me.
Wasn't Rex.
No.
So here is our spectrum. Thank you all for your attention. We've run over on time. We really appreciate your attention.